one of the consequences we've looked at is obviously the impact of what the relationships with China would be, what would happen internally in Iran to its population. The impact we briefly talked about coming across, I think, as one of the aspects of looking at regime change or a war in Iran is people movement across the globe and the total destabilization. And the idea that you can put in our mates in charge, just replacing one wealthy regime of individuals with another regime. The communists did that, didn't they? They got rid of the czars and just put their own czars in place. That's all that we're looking at when you look at regime change. But one of the most immediate impacts to us would be if we go to war, or the Iranians carry out exactly what they said the very following day, is that the Iran parliament approved closing the Strait of Hormuz after the US strike. And so they officially went, and with their parliament, whether we agree it's a democracy or not, but I can't see any country in the world, if they've been attacked and bombed, that would not use the only influence that they've got as a parliament as a whole, because anyone who opposed it would actually be probably thrown in jail, even in this country. And we're seeing that now because for those who want to have a different idea. But the Strait of Hormuz here is a very clear, important trading route across the globe. 27% of the world's oil trade, 20% of liquid gas. And just going to go through a couple of things. To those people who don't know where it is, it's there right in the middle of a bottom of Iran, close to the United Arab Emirates. It's a very small... And Oman. And it's a very small area, because as I come in, I get a close-up on it. I want to show people the wider picture. And then you come in and you see here, this very small element, a couple of islands in there, and you see the West's favourites of UAE and Oman on one side, and the West's hated country, Iran, on the other. And that little area there, as you say, is transporting 27% of world's oil and about 20% of LPG all across the globe, from Saudi Arabia and from Iran itself, in oil products that go on then to be used in the production of manufactured products, to the oil and petrol that we see in our cars. So clearly a very important part when you're looking at over 25%, nearly a third of the world's oil being transported for a very small area. And just to give you some idea, this is the threat to blockade it there. You see these, it's a very tight turn in that corner, and the shipping elements, you've got deep shipping lanes, is even more narrow on there. So it's an easy element, and you can see just on the right there where Bahrain is, where you've got the HQ of the US Fifth Fleet, which they believe is now safe because they've bombed enough of what they think is the Iranians' military not to actually attack it if Hormuz is closed. So there we have an element that's showing the deep shipping shipping lanes, the amount of oil that's transported. I'm just going to whip through this one because it's a bit of a broader view of that same thing. Now, what we've got here from the US Energy Information Administration, it says that Straits of Hormuz remains a critical choke point. And we can see here some of the products, crude and oil and condensates, how those levels have been roughly over the past 5 years. They've stabilized after Ukraine, but they're still pretty high, despite the fact that we're adding wind energy and other forms of energy to try and dispense with this. And what I like about when you read this article for people, it talks about some of the impacts on the price of Brent crude oil. It immediately jumped up only $5 on this. But if you look where some of the estimates are, it's a concern that if it is closed, it will go $120, $130. So a good 40% higher than where we are, maybe 50 straight away. And if you look at what happened in Ukraine, when we had Ukraine, it was stabilized about $120. Did any of us think we were living in a time of plenty when those oil prices there? What did it happen to your house costs and your jobs?
Yes.
So this is a really important point, that the choke points are in there.
And you've got to add one more detail, which is that if you go back to the map, the previous map, there, you got the Bab el-Mandab Strait as well.
Yes.
Which is controlled by the Houthi, and they managed to shut it down even in the face of American airstrikes until the U.S. negotiated a separate deal, supposedly behind Israel's backs, for the reopening of Bab el-Mandab to American shipping, but not to Israeli shipping. So there are two choke points here that are very much under Iranian influence. And Bab el-Mandab obviously leads to the Suez Canal, which is one of the key arteries for global trade. So there is this additional dimension, and the Houthi have said that they're going to join the Iranians if there is a shutdown of Hormuz. They'll also shut down Bab el-Mandab to do their part. So it becomes a serious complicating factor here. Doesn't destroy the global economy or damage it as much as a big spike in oil prices, but it's an additional complication and it's a big problem.
And I think that's an added important point to see, that when we get choke points, that will mean that the Americans will have to step in to go in there. They'll go in there, and this causes a broader conflict that will rise. And you've got the IE saying at the moment the world can't afford to relax about oil security. This is a pretty interesting article in the way that they say, they talked about attacks in Saudi Arabia, then they moved on, is oil under pressure. The trends in oil intensity there, they're still looking pretty high despite everything. That's their main point. The trends in GDP per capita based on oil is there. We're not as high as the 70s and 80s, but it's improving in terms of the stabilization of our economy. And that's why Bank of England can say, we'll look at interest rates falling, which helps your mortgage prices. So they're saying, if you look at this coming through, but one of the points I wanted to pull from this is, if you look at China, India, and Southeast Asia, which we're going to come on to importantly as well. China, big friend, obviously, of Iran for lots of economic reasons. You can see how many millions of barrels of oil a day they're requiring from this. They're up to like 14 out of the 50 million barrels of oil a day that's coming out of there. They're the biggest recipients as a particular nation. India, they're up nearly between 8 and 9 going in there. And Southeast Asia, also around 8. So you're looking at literally over half of the oil is actually going to those three nations. And what do they produce for us? Lots of things we were discussing before.
So if you end up basically with an oil shutdown, everything across the world becomes much more expensive because the oil shortage drives up prices, the Chinese economy stutters. We're buying everything from China, thanks to the same stupid politicians who gave us the Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya and Syrian wars. And so this ends up with a big knock-on effect on everything economic if it happens. Now, there's a lot of questions on the Iranians' ability to do this and how much damage they could do, especially since the U.S. Navy won't be sitting idly by. But even then, the increase in prices and the increase of insurance premiums will be felt across the board in the global economy, even accepting the possibility that the Iranians won't have 100% success and that any success that they have will be temporary. It's a suicide option for them, but if it's a regime change war against them,
why not?
Why not? Exactly. So don't put crazy people in a corner seems to be a wise policy across the board.
You know, I get the feeling there's big round tables like this with a whole load of warmongering and guys thinking this is our great opportunity to once again be like our fathers and grandfathers of the past. And look, let's hope that they bomb one of our ships, because if they bomb one of our ships, then we can move everybody else in. And that's the sort of war games that's going through their heads. And I'm look, just for people who want to read this kind of particular article, it talks about the difference in the crude oil that's being processed as well. You know, it's a big impact on Japan and Korea because they require more, 70% here it says, of the processed refining for Japan and Korea. It would decimate Japan and Korea initially. Because they are so reliant on this particular type of oil, even though they receive less than the Chinese and the Indians. But they are one of the bigger players in terms of the overall market. And I look at the implications on tensions for global economy. This is from JP Morgan's reports. I've got two I've put up for people here, one 2025 and one 2024. This, I think, is the 2025 one, just to make sure. I've got, published 4 days ago. This is actually less phlegmatic about the implication. It does talk about the fact we've had a spike recently of $61 to 78p per barrel, and I'll come to the implications of what that means on the streets for those from the UK who are watching. I'm not sure necessarily about the US, because you're protected a lot more by your own markets and the national oil kind of security that they provided for themselves. This is to your point, Faraz. So this says if Iran only has 4% of global oil productions, its monthly exports are only about 1.7 million barrels per day. So it has a massive impact on them if they cut it off, because it's a big earner. Big impacts, though, Saudi Arabia and UAE coming through there. Looking through this on, that's a little annoying, the shares of global oil down there. It goes on to talk about inflation and interest rates here. So this is a very shorter one compared to the 2005, but they talk about the shocks that will be generated in wage demands, sustained inflationary pressures, monetary policy leading to tightening, and we've already had a period of, think of growth in this country, no growth whatsoever.
Yep.
A little bit better and more in-depth is their 2024. I'm going to skip the top because I want people, because it's the same sort of overview. And they talk about what we're watching. This is where we invaded Ukraine. This is where it's come down and why we've had a period. And that's quite a substantial fall.
Yes.
It's a significant fall, 130 to 70, over 50%. And we've not seen a 50% cut in oil prices in our pumps or even the energy costs.
Yes.
Despite it falling 50%.
Well, we can thank Ed Miliband, yes.
And we can certainly do that, absolutely. And we've had a little bit of play between, 80 and 90. But I just want people to think about the fact that our energy costs are so high now, and yet we're back to the levels of pre-Ukraine.
Yes.
In terms of the war. If you look at the bottom of that, where we are, and bottom there, okay, that's the spike we've had recently because everyone's worried about it. But this is where we were, and we're already in dire straits.
Yes.
If this spikes up again to 120, 130, or potentially $160, which is referenced in some of the reports that I've been seeing, then we would be absolutely crucified as a nation. Yep. They talk about broader conflicts, which is your point at hand, and I agree with that. I think the risk of transit disruption, again, are points that you've both raised today, are very important, the costs of insurance. But overall, if they decide to go to the nuclear option, now we then need to analyze some of the aspects. The impact of the Russian invasion, I'm going to move across quickly looking on times, but we know this. It began in 2022. The OBR talked about inflation peaking at 9% at the end of 20. Well, that's an interesting one, 9% at the period of 20222. I've obviously aged a lot since there, so well done, CEPR. But you get the point. So we've got this overall, why is it important? There it is, narrow lane, lots of oil going through, very important types of oil for some countries like Japan. Yep. The military bases of America surrounding the whole area, the Houthis on one side, close it down, cut it off, shut it off, has an impact bigger than we faced in Ukraine, 9% inflation. So I think this one is just a quick one for everyone, how energy prices for the UK person, you've got to think about it goes down there. For every $10 higher, and we've just had $13 in the last couple of days, get out and buy your oil and your petrol, fill your tank today, because by the end of the week, this will increase 7 to 8p per $10. If it goes up from where we are now at $78 to $130, you're looking at adding another 40p per litre on your car.
This is painful.
Absolutely.
And I'm sure when Keir Starmer supports this, he's sort of thinking about the British consumer and the welfare of the British consumer.
Oh, I imagine he is with his free car, and he's just working out who else is going to pay for him. But I just find it interesting that, as an aside, how many MPs from the Labour Party or any political party are going to reference the cost of living crisis to ourselves as a consequence of supporting this. How many will talk about mass immigration that will, as a result, we may get Rupert Lowe talk about that, but very few others will. Yes. In the end, all of them will fall to support this idea, just as they supported Afghanistan, just as they supported Iraq and just as they supported everything else. And it's kind of sod the consequences
Yes.
for the citizens of Europe
That's fundamentally the attitude.
who can't afford it.
Well, after 30 years, I'm kind of used to it.
Yeah.
Well, it is, and I mean, isn't it slightly depressing that, you know, with a bit of logic and a bit of history and a bit of common sense, you can bring all of these together. You can point it out, and it's like taking the horses to water, and none of them will drink it. They'd rather poison
But
themselves.
the thinking for the Americans could be much more cynical than that. The thinking for the Americans could be, we know this is going to damage Europe enormously. We know that this is going to damage Asia enormously. Therefore, it is good for us because we have our own energy reserves and we have Canada's energy reserves.
Yes.
So the thinking for the Americans could be considerably more cynical. And if you accept that the US is in decline, and if you accept that China has its own structural problems, one way of deeply increasing the structural problems facing the rest of the world, more so than it does for the United States, is to have a policy that closes the American border, but that also disrupts all of Europe and Asia at the same time. So this is a way of strengthening the American empire at a time of general decay, which makes it even more diabolical in a sense.
I've got a line that's coming off, feeding off from what you're doing now. It's just in terms of that intellectual line. Do you think this now fits in quite comfortably with the idea of tariffs?
Yes.
Because he's already saying to the rest of the world, I'm going to ignore the impact on the rest of Europe and the Middle East and Asia, because we're now forcing people to actually pay to sell their products to us and therefore increase on the level of income. We will get a shock, but we're going to be insulated on the energy shocks because of the way we're dealing with it. And by bringing products online, we're now insulating ourselves. So that is going back to American first policy.
In July, the temporary exemptions for the tariffs that were initially announced expire. And there haven't been any trade agreements that were signed.
No.
And so, in a very cynical way, the Americans end up with a stronger hand for these agreements if they have access to their own cheap energy, and the rest of the world is facing energy chaos.
And they're much better off anyway.
And they're much better off anyway.
Yeah.
So this is this shows the importance of countries thinking for themselves. It shows the insanity of Britain not developing North Sea resources.
Yes.
It shows the insanity of Europe shutting down nuclear.
Yeah.
It shows the whole madness of green energy and of the hostility to hydrocarbons and the hostility to Russia. This is what this policy highlights. Basically, you've handed your sovereignty and your economic lifeblood to the Americans, and the Americans have proven that they won't learn from history and from bad military interventions, and so long as other people suffer more than they do, this is acceptable. So this is a level of cynicism that you just have to be accustomed to the diabolical to be able to think about clearly.
But it's really frustrating because whenever I go out to the States, and you always find sensible heads out there who understand, and they were part of the MAGA movement that I met. They were part of the individuals who said, yeah, like me, we don't like what's happening in Iran. We don't really like what's happening to an extent in Russia. But we understand the reason why we're behind the idea of no wars is not to destabilize the economy, because Europe is actually struggling heavily, and we need to support you by closing the borders in our country, gives you the messages out there, returning freedom of speech back in our countries, helps you in yours. But in turn, there's a whole other bunch of Americans who are hidden behind, whether they call it the deep state, whether they call it the military-industrial complex, is a cadre of elites out there who really don't like what the MAGA movement is as a whole, just as the anti-European, the European Union mob don't like anyone that's Brexit, who are just happy to say we want to continue with this empire. And in a way, the rest of you can go and just find your own route out the way, and we'll ignore you. Where this band of real patriotic Americans who understand the importance of working with us are being ignored.
Yes.
Where do we see this now with the Trump kind of group?
Well, the big effect of Trump going into a war with Iran is to discredit the idea of America first, and to sort of make the whole MAGA movement, America First movement seem as an impossibility. You're basically discrediting elections.
It'll be interesting to see how much that punches during the midterms.
Yes.
As they come up.
Exactly.
I got a feeling that what they've done is this is the clever movement by the backdoor elites to actually put a puncture hole into the MAGA movement. It separates those now who fully understand our side of the argument and those who say, no, we've just got to protect Israel and bomb the hell out of Iran come what may. And they like that because then that divides it, and then it means that the Republican, the GOP, who've been sat there all along, are saying we can separate them now.
And it means that everybody who says, I oppose interventions that the Israelis have supported, gets cast as an anti-Semite.
Yes.
Or gets cast as an Iran apologist or as a Putin apologist or what have you. When this is, it just provides a lot of additional ammunition for attacking genuine people who want their own people and their own countries placed first, above the concerns of bankers, globalists, green energy lunatics, interventionists, etc., etc.
I do.
But then that will entirely just fracture all of the goodwill that Trump's campaign and Trump's first few months put back into the American system. The confidence with voters it put back into the institutions. A number of young men signing up to the military again after long stagnation. And if even further than that, it could be even more hazardous for them, because if you have if things escalate in Iran and you get regime change, you get America even further drawn into it, then what you're going to end up with is a lot of Americans at home who are now, have fallen off of the MAGA train and actually just don't think democracy is worth it at all.
No.
And then you've got a core component of, I know it's Republican, it's a constitutional Republican, not a democracy, but you'll get, the idea of voting, and so people will resort eventually to other options, as opposed to being drawn into foreign wars over and over again.
Given the influence of Palantir and given the capabilities of the surveillance state, and given that the NSA is spying on everybody, and in this country, same dynamics, all over Europe, same dynamics. We know that, for example, the French made Telegram give them backdoor access to everything that is happening in Telegram.
And the pressuring on WhatsApp too.
Exactly. So it just means that the surveillance state gets to pick off its enemies and pursue policies that are clearly not in anybody's interests. Having pretty much sold all industrial capabilities to the Chinese and destroyed the ability of the West to provide itself with cheap energy. It's a level of extremism that people can't put their heads around, but it's very materialistic extremism, very hostile extremism, and it lacks any sense of Christian love for your own people. The whole idea that the duty of the rulers is towards the ruled, that you are obligated to have care for the people that you're governing, that if you're well off and God has bestowed upon you great power or great wealth, that leaves you with a larger obligation towards those around you. This is completely absent from the minds of people who rule us because they are not Christian.
It's a kind of sheriff.
They're materialists.
It's a sheriff of Nottingham-style politics.
Yes,
as long as I'm there, I'll have a few friends around me who are doing very well.
Precisely.
But we will just try and steal and take whatever we can from the people, and every now and again, those who are opposing it will chop them off.
I really like that framing, sheriff.
Yes.
Sheriff
of Nottingham. Yes.
I'm going to try to whip through looking at the time because there may well be comments, and we've got this, but. There are some elements about it that we've got to consider in a depth. One of those is China, and we talked about China being a very good friend at the moment with Iran, but they will actually have a major impact. I think this is one of the points we picked up beforehand, is that we've seen that they have a huge amount of importing. From the cost of crude oil to them is $503 billion in 2024. So that's a huge amount. It is a little bit less. I'm not sure if this is the article that shows they're saving a billion. Is it 1 million barrels a day or whatever? Is this the particular one? But this just shows the level of crude oil that's been going to China. Then the next one just goes to show, again, that picture that we saw early on but brought up. for China, India, and Southeast Asia, how it impacts them. So again, China's got a big element in this game here. And what you have noticed, and I think this is, I'm glad you showed this one to me before we came on air, is I was looking for something to show about the stockpiling later on. But China is stockpiling crude oil. And maybe they've also been aware of what we're talking about, that America doesn't care what's going to happen. We will go in and disrupt. So they have actually been adding more than 1 million barrels per day to its strategic and commercial stockpiles.
Yes. So they import around 11 to 12 million barrels per day. They have a massive refining capacity that the rest of the world also depends on. And they're stockpiling essentially more than 10% of what they consume every day. With the idea being that they need a reserve precisely for this kind of
they're preparing for war too.
They're preparing for war as well. And if they end up facing the Americans in Taiwan and somehow the Americans blockade Chinese ports, they will need that oil reserve in order to survive. So it's... and
you looked at that there at that bottom figure I found interesting as well, the 13.92 barrels of crude oil that is being refined as well.
Yes.
So they're stepping up in terms of that level.
Yep.
Then you've got the other big player in the region. We talked about India. Sorry, I thought this was about India here. Maybe I've just come out here. Yeah, well, it will impact India. 50% of its LNG imports flow through this route and 40% of India's oil. Bearing in mind that the kind of whole of the Trump view at the moment is to try and shift products from China. A lot of companies have been flowing into India for cheap labor and cheap oil. So if they hit that, they reckon that it will increase their costs 20-25%, which are huge for the costs coming across to the rest of us. Now, the kind of fly or protective fly in the ointment is that the IEA are estimating that the highest levels of strategic reserves that they've ever done. So that kind of gets to me. This is July 2019, so I expect it to be more. So they've been, countries hold about 1.5 billion barrels of oil for emergencies. So looking at that, they've got significant amounts, and you've got 2.9 billion above the higher average. This reminds me of what happened in the miners' strikes in the UK. The miners' strikes hurt us in the 70s, so Thatcher encouraged stockpiling of coke and coal. And we also did deals with other countries to be able to import more when we had a miners' strike. Right. So it strikes me that some of these countries have been preparing for this particular moment, particularly if we're looking at what the history you've talked about. So I would say we're looking at what can be done. Well, obviously you can store it and save it for a while. Then militarily and I suppose diplomatically, US has asked China to tell Iran not to retaliate against Israel. That was before. And then they've come in and said, now that they have retaliated, and Israel have bombed and then retaliated back, will you please, China, dissuade Iran from closing the Straits of Hormuz? I find those two quite peculiar.
I think they're trying to humiliate the Chinese.
Yeah.
I think they're pushing the Iranians into a corner very deliberately. And I think that this is more nefarious than it appears.
Yeah.
This is a war of choice that wasn't necessary. And the consequences some of them are at least intended.
Yeah.
Let's put it this way.
I think there is intention, and I'm going to finish with this in the sense that if China is not able to do this, if America's threats do not stop the Straits of Hormuz being closed, then you've always got what Trump said at the end of the day, which is if they close the Straits of Hormuz, and I can't find the link, someone else, if they can, send it to us, is that we'll bomb them.
If you would like to watch the full uncut version that is also uncensored, head on over to lotuseaters.com to find out more.